So Esther, welcome along to Plymouth Humanists, and give Esther a round of applause, and over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Right, I'll just share my screen. The usual process. Is that all okay there? Ooh. Okay, hi, yes, so I'm Ester Kincova, and I'm a research and policy officer at the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. So I'll be talking about UK drug policy reform, but I thought that I would contextualize it within the history of prohibition that we have had globally, and also reform that has been happening globally, so that you can see where we are in comparison in the UK. As Jamie said, we have seen swaves of quite large and significant drug policy reform. And so that's really important for us to see where we can go within the UK, but also what we are trying to establish in the UK as, not in the UK, as what kind of legal regulation we really do want to see. What are we learning from what is happening around the world, and where are we going to go with this? So yes, so we are an independent think tank. We are totally, we're totally charity-based. We do not take any income from corporations. We really pride ourselves on that, because our vision is this world where drug policy promotes health, protects the vulnerable, and puts safety first. It is really, really core principles that we must ensure that drug policy is rooted in public health rather than criminal justice, protects human rights, and we must also have social justice ensured throughout this. How we do this as an organisation is we educate the public and policymakers on effective drug policy. So we do a lot of advocacy work. We develop and promote viable alternatives to prohibition through a series of publications which are available on our website. And we also provide a voice for those directly affected by drug policy failures, which we think is absolutely key to informing how the debate is taken, which direction it goes, and ensuring that the people who have been most affected are involved. Oh, let me just... So that takes me to Anyone's Child, which is our campaigning arm of Transform. It was set up by families who've been negatively affected by drug controls from around the world, who are now campaigning for law reform. It was originally a UK thing, however, it is now internationally run. And I have a short video which just summarizes the idea of Anyone's Child, which is, let me just get that up for you.
Anyone's Child is a group of families whose relatives have died, disappeared, or been locked up as a result of the war on drugs. We believe that drug policy causes more harm than drugs themselves. What has happened to our children could happen to anyone's child, which is why drugs need to be legally controlled and regulated.
My daughter.
Mi primo.
My brother. My son.
We never dreamed this would happen to us. We are a collective of families from around the world who see an urgent need for change. We believe that drugs are dangerous, and that's exactly why we want them legally regulated. We want governments, not gangsters, to control the drugs trade. We want to promote health, reduce crime, and protect all of our children.
If families work together, we can get change now. The time is right.
So that is just a very brief summary of what Anyone's Child is. And it's really important to us because these are the families that remind us that it's not just statistics and numbers, but really people's lives and people who have been affected. And there are so many tragic stories in that have been caused by prohibition that could have been avoided entirely. So the current system is failing, and that is what we are trying to show policymakers especially. But also the public, to acknowledge that prohibition has really not achieved what it was set out to do. And when it was first established, the idea of global prohibition, particularly in 1961 under the UN Single Convention, the idea was that we could create a drug-free world. And it was the principle that drugs are harmful, so we can get rid of them and people won't be using them. However, 50 years later, or 60 years later rather, the reality is completely different. Thousands of people have been criminalized for drug possession. Millions has been wasted in law enforcement trying to obstruct both supply and production, but as well as people who've been using. Drug deaths are at record levels in many countries. And actually the ultimate thing is that drug use is higher than when the war was declared. So it has not achieved its stated goals. And the question is then why are we continuing to uphold a system that is not working? And why are we not looking for alternatives? Yes, so as I said, this is the original foundation of the legal obligation for global prohibition, is the 1961 UN Single Convention, which was then followed in 1971 by President Nixon's infamous declaration of war on drugs. And that same decade, the countries which had ratified the UN Single Convention brought in their own domestic level enforcement, which is how we came to our UK Misuse of Drugs Act, which was passed in 1971 and then came into action in 1973. What prohibition has achieved, rather than the drug-free world, is a multitude of harms in so many different areas. And it also demonstrates how drug policy does not operate in a silo, it is across systems. So from threatening public health, though the war on drugs has been promoted as a way of protecting health, the idea that drug use is harmful, instead it's really achieved completely the opposite. It's failed in its key aim of reducing or eliminating drug use, but has instead created risks and new health harms because it has created such a stigma. It's really pushed drug use into the corners of society and has created practical obstacles to effective public health interventions that could reduce these harms. This is from increasing drug-related deaths to terrible increases in HIV, and as well as criminalization, which has encouraged high-risk drug use behaviors. And ultimately, there is no public health element in this, though this is how it is presented. Undermining peace and security. The UN attempts to promote the security of its member states through implementing a drug control system that treats the use of certain drugs as an existential threat to society. However, this approach is having completely opposite effect. It's undermining peace and security and creating a huge criminal market that is enriching criminal organizations. The illegal drug market, I don't actually have estimates of the world drug market, but the UK drug market last year was estimated by the government's own independent drug review to be worth £9 billion, which is absolutely astounding. And it's only ever increasing. And it's certainly argued that the income from drugs really significantly underpins a lot of other criminal activities. So what we have done through prohibition is hand over this lucrative market to criminal organizations. In addition, it undermines in development. So criminal drug producers and traffickers seek out to operate in marginal and undeveloped regions where vulnerable populations can be exploited and weak authorities are kept at bay. The corruption, violence, conflict, and instability that follows undermines social and economic growth and can lock regions into a spiral of underdevelopment, which we've seen in many countries. And we have also seen it bounce from country to country. So it doesn't just stay in one. It is a continuous and actually very responsive market that is able to react to enforcements and set up in other places. And in terms of human rights are they're completely undermined because despite the idea of reducing drug use, so many people are criminalized for their drug use. And in countries, and I'm sure you will be aware, such as the Philippines, there is such a vicious attack on people's lives for using drugs. And the other issue is that for the absolute conviction of drug law enforcement, punishments for drug possession or use are really disproportionate to the crime that they are. The other thing is that what we perhaps don't think so much about is the environmental damage of prohibition, and it is from deforestation and pollution, but also so deforestation comes from attempting to grow cannabis or cocaine illegally. So it is completely under the radar of governments. And then the government's response is to, for example, in Colombia, oh, sorry, I've completely forgotten the word, fumigate, spray cocaine, coca plantations. And we have seen that not only does that totally decimate whatever environment that is being attacked, but it also has a negligible effect as it just creates more deforestation as they move on. And actually recently, Colombia has announced that they will be restarting their fumigation program, which was paused a couple of years ago, which is a hugely problematic thing. And it's a slight follow on from the Trump administration, which we hope that Biden may intervene in. But it goes to show that there is still a total conviction in these sort of very harmful and counterproductive practices to obstruct production and supply. And we are to see if Colombia will continue their fumigation. And this is, I think, a really neat way of demonstrating also the hypocrisy of prohibition. So on the left, we have a field of illicit poppy crop, which is being, I think I confidently would say it's Afghanistan, as Afghanistan produces 90% of heroin globally, and it's being cut down by the army. However, on the right, we have a legal poppy crop, which is growing just outside of Winchester. My colleague took this photo on a walk, and this is supplying the legal opium market, medical opium market. So we have a dual existence where we can have crops in Afghanistan that are being totally decimated because they are part of the illicit market. However, still the acknowledgement that opium has a use and being grown legally within the UK. And just to follow, so that is a very sad reality, but also, as I just said, you can talk about these very big ideas and systems, but I think it's really important to remember exactly who the people are that are on the ground, who've experienced the negative effects. And for that reason, I'd like to show you a video of one of our Anyone's Child campaigners, Ray, and his experience of UK drug laws.
It would be easy to say that drugs killed my sons and they should continue to be banned. But they knew that drugs were illegal, particularly over here on the Isle of Man, that they can be very harsh on anybody who's caught. But that didn't stop them using it. On December 3rd, 2014, I was due to travel to London to go to an art gallery and catch up with my son, Jacques. I did see Jack that day, but not in London. He was lying on a mortuary in the Royal Bolton Hospital beside his younger brother, Torin. Jack was 20, Torin 19. They had both died of what was subsequently found to be an overdose of MDMA, ecstasy. We knew from past experiences that Jacques had taken various drugs. Torin seemed different. He had seen his brother's substance-fueled behaviour and the consequences, and appeared to reject any form of drug taking. We knew many of their friends took drugs too, despite being educated and informed of the risks. Drug taking is part of youth culture. Jacques and Torin were beautiful boys, creative, intelligent, sensitive and amusing. They had everything to live for, but like so many others, despite knowing drugs were potentially dangerous and illegal, enjoyed their effects. The current legislation and well-meaning education policies have failed dismally to prevent deaths or stop people getting drugs, and it's time for a change. It's time to accept people want to use drugs and legally regulate them. This doesn't mean a free-for-all. It means taking control of drugs away from criminals and giving it to the government. My message to Mr. Cameron is you are capable of changing this. You can make it happen. Those who choose to take recreational drugs for whatever reason should have the right to know exactly what they are taking without fear of prosecution and the possibility of a life-changing criminal record. Banning does not and will never work. My wife and I have blighted lives. Everything we wanted, our futures, are no longer important. I don't want anybody to go through what we've been through.
So that's our incredible, I'm sorry. That's our incredible Anyone's Child activist, Ray. And it is a dreadful experience that he has had. And I think it really actually then brings down to earth. We can, yes, looking at the global destruction and how this market has been put into the hands of criminal organizations, this is one of the consequences of that prohibition in the UK and in so many other countries, and it happens to so many families, which is exactly why it's called Anyone's Child. Because if you have a criminal market and criminal organizations looking after this market, then there is no incentive to ensuring that the products are safe, that the production is fair trade or in not encroaching on human rights, is ensuring proper work conditions. And when you get right down to the supply end, whatever anyone is buying, they cannot be certain what they're getting. And the other terrible consequence then is that with prohibition, people are afraid once things go wrong to come and call for help because they don't know what the consequences of that may be, because criminalization of use hangs over anyone's head. So this is why we are proposing a legally regulated market. And we have written many publications. These are some of our key ones. Our most recent is How to Regulate Stimulants, which is specifically cocaine, amphetamines, and MDMA. We started in 2010 with our first blueprint for regulation, which was a broad idea of how we think drugs should be legally regulated and what our ideal vision is for a market that currently has absolutely no recourse to government. And following that, we did a How to Regulate Cannabis, a practical guide, which was timely as it was just the beginning of the wave of legal regulation of cannabis in Canada and the US. So what is legal regulation? I think that is something that we are often asked because there are very different ideas of what that would mean. And often people will call it legalization and say, well, as soon as we legalize, then it will be a free-for-all and anyone can buy drugs. However, the reality is that people are already able to access the drug market. That doesn't make a difference whether that is it's illicit or not. But what we mean by legal regulation is that it's legalized and controlled. We do not see a vision for drugs, which is drugs available in the supermarkets on the shelves next to your bottles of wine. We don't think that is a safe way because drugs ultimately are dangerous products. We are not arguing that they are not. And they need to be safely controlled so that people are able to use them safely if they are going to do so. And so ultimately, we believe that governments need to be in control of drugs rather than being put to their free market. And prohibition has been argued as the radical policy. However, regulation in everything else is the norm. We see regulation already in alcohol and tobacco, and even coffee and tea are drugs that we have on our market, and they have certain standards that we can buy them for. So I don't know, we must really move away from, in the conversation for drugs, that prohibition is the answer, regulation is radical. It's the other way around. And historically, the US saw its experience of prohibition of alcohol in the 20s, and it ultimately had totally the opposite outcomes, and they realized that it had to be regulated instead. So we really, really want that to be, we want to create the same understanding that drugs are in this category. And I think this is a really helpful way to visualize this. So under an unregulated criminal market, social and health harms go up. That's ultra prohibition. We want to, when you swing right through to an unregulated legal market where you let the companies manage the market and sell however they like, then social and health harms will also go up, exactly in the same way that we've seen with tobacco and alcohol industries in the past. An unregulated legal market is also not safe. And so we really think it needs to lie somewhere in the middle, with a strict legal regulation system that allows for safe product supply, but without the power of individual companies marketing and pushing the products onto the users. Yes, so as I've said, I think alcohol and tobacco are very important lessons to take from. We really want to limit involvement of commercial enterprises, and we don't want to encourage maximum excess consumption. It's really key to this, and I think that is where legal regulation can sometimes be misconstrued as the idea that we are just wanting to open up a market for people to use. We don't want to see cocaine adverts on the sides of buses. That is not a safe application of legalized drugs. So we recognize that there is no one size fits all to how to legally regulate. It's very different talking about heroin than it is about cannabis. And for that reason, we propose different levels of regulation based on the risk of the product. So the riskier the drug, the stricter the controls on it. And we also must acknowledge that there are many drugs already regulated for medical use. So as I previously showed you, the two fields of poppies, opium is used, opioids are used in medical supply. So there already exists a market that is providing these drugs. It's just currently established as a medical use only market. And so we don't need to go too far to think how there's production and supply of these drugs can be put to adult recreational use. And this is how we would regulate. We would regulate right from production all the way to outlets. There would be quality control and testing at production level, and there would be ensuring of what would go in, where it was supplied, and then leading on to the products, an absolutely strict dosage, preparation, price, and packaging. We have, actually, I have an image I will show you in the Q&A. We've developed our own proposed idea of what we think packaging should look like, because we don't want it to look attractive or appealing. It just needs to fit a purpose. There shouldn't be the same sort of marketing and commercialization of these products, because they need to be treated with the seriousness that they are for use. Similarly, then when we have vendors, they need to be licensed and vetted, and we need to ensure that they know how to properly give out harm reduction advice and are good places for people to come if they are using, to also perhaps approach to get help if they want it, or any other usage advice that they may need, which currently doesn't necessarily exist. In the ideal world, this would be a vendor that can tell you how much you should take, and safely is what we need. And it opens up a honest conversation about drug use as well. And then we have the outlets, which would vary, again, depending on the drug. So we already see that we have cannabis outlets in Canada and the US, which are regulated, and they have quite strict ideas in varying on the states of outlet density, how they appear, can they have anything to do with a cannabis branding on the outside of their shops, or on the inside, how are they laid out? There are often certain rules around being so far away from schools, so ensuring that and also ensuring that it works with the communities too, so that communities can agree where outlets should be placed. And then finally, it's the biggest question is how do you stop people buying? And the natural thing, just like with alcohol and tobacco, is age controls, is to stop children from accessing this market. We think that's really, really important. So these are our 5 basic regulatory models, right from prescription, something such as heroin. Prescribed heroin already exists in the UK. It's known as heroin assisted treatment. And actually it's called the British model because we've had prescribed heroin in the UK as a non-medical use since the 1920s, as it was recognised that this was a far more effective way to keep people safe who are struggling with heroin use than pushing them into using in the criminal market. Over the years, the drug services and funding obviously have cut significantly the access to heroin prescription. However, there has been a recent pilot in Middlesbrough, which has been extremely successful in demonstrating the value of prescribing heroin, and has shown both increased health, but also a marked drop in criminal acquisitive crime, as acquisitive crime is very linked to drug use. Then there are things like pharmacy models where you could say buy cocaine or MDMA. So these are still need to be more strict and controlled, and they need a trained person to be able to access it. Right through to, then we have licensed sales, which is similar to alcohol. Licensed premises, also similar to alcohol use, and then unlicensed sales for something like coca tea. So it really is, as you can see, the risk base is highest risk, strictest, down to lowest risk, least strict. And I think these 2 infographics just show exactly what the vision is. So on the left, we have the reality of prohibition to regulation, and what we can see and what we would hope to see from legal regulation is ensuring that revenues, the other thing is that revenues and taxes would go to government, which has been the case in many states in the US, but especially some which have really written it. I think it was Colorado that set up the first $2 billion in taxes would go towards education. So a huge commitment financially, which financially is an incentive for policymakers if you present the financial argument. And then on the right, we have a visual of how the 3 different risk tiers would work for something like cocaine, because I know that people may say, oh, there are very different coca products, and are we looking to create a legal access to crack cocaine similarly to cocaine powder, because crack cocaine has been historically linked to far greater health harms and social harms. And so this is a short summary of how we have identified the different risks and how they should actually be controlled. So something such as coca leaf, tea and oral products, which are not so familiar here in the UK because there's no financial incentive for criminal organisations to bring coca leaf to the UK over cocaine powder when it's far heavier, so it's far more of a South American thing, would have fair trade production. They are lower risk, less potent products, so they'd have product information on their packaging in the same way that tea possibly would, or coffee, and they'd be available at commercial retail, but with age controls. And then leading on to cocaine powder, again, with a fair trade production of the coca, which then moves on to a regulated pharmaceutical production, which would be produced by government awarded licenses. No branding or marketing, which is very key, in a pharmacy style retail and ration purchase. So we are recommending a gram of cocaine powder would be available as one purchase in a pharmacy style let, and age controls. And then you come to crack cocaine, and we do not advocate for retail of crack cocaine. Instead, we would want a health-based response with decriminalization of possession of use, so that no longer would people who use get taken into the criminal system and criminalized, which often spirals their situations, but instead be offered treatment and help if they so wanted it. And to add to that, we would have harm reduction methods such as supervised consumption venues, which exist in many countries around the world. There are about 150 supervised consumption venues around the world, not all necessarily offering crack cocaine smoking, but that is an option. And I think that is actually one of the first things that we could be setting up even without having a legally regulated market, is supervised consumption venues in the UK. And though our legally regulated market and the blueprint we put out in 2010 seemed like a very far-fetched idea, the debate has really moved on, and it's really, really moving to from the margins to the mainstream. And I think that has definitely been visible, especially with cannabis legalization and regulation, which we have seen in Canada and Uruguay. Uruguay had legally regulated in 2013, followed by Canada, which was the first G7 country to regulate in 2018. But since then, we've also had Mexico is passing a bill this month. I think it is passing actually this week as we speak, on legally regulating cannabis. So, and in the last run of elections, we saw 4 more states legally regulate cannabis in the US, which has taken us to 16 states in the US, which is quite remarkable, because that means, if my geography is right, you can walk from southern Mexico all the way to Canada and stay in a legally regulated state or country. Yes, there you go. But the other thing that I think is far greater is that there has been a cocaine regulation bill in the Colombian Senate. And Colombia is one of the biggest producers of cocaine for the global market, and has historically had such great problems with its criminal organizations. And what is great about this bill is, often when we watch legal regulation in its process, as our ideas of how we think it should be set up are very set in our minds, we may not be seeing that in legislation that is happening around the world. However, the Colombian bill is very similar to our proposals for cocaine regulation that we set out in our stimulants book. And we worked closely with the author of the bill on this. I recommend you go to our blog to read. We've got an interview with the lead author on our pages, as well as this outline of what is actually currently happening. I would like to caveat that with the fact that we don't actually expect this to be passed as a bill, because the current governmental power is not in favour. This is an opposition bill, and opposition bills, as we know from experiences in our own country, don't often have a great chance if the government in power is not with it as well. However, it is remarkable to see an actual proposal for cocaine regulation, which considers indigenous and local growers, and is not only limited to cocoa. You would have expected that perhaps for the first initial bill, there would just be a coca leaf regulations, as we have seen in Bolivia, which is a far easier thing politically to discuss and implement. But instead, we are also seeing cocaine powder being discussed. Yes, so is great. And the win was in the first round of readings in the Senate last week, but there are 4 more, so we will watch with anticipation. Yes, so it's now a core element of the drug policy discourse, as we can see. And it's really vital for us that we are able to inform debate and make sure that this legal regulation is happening in a positive way. We don't want to see it being hijacked by corporate industries and being taken away from what is actually a great opportunity to bring in social justice for people who have been so terribly affected by the war on drugs in the past, and also creating something that is actually safe in the future, because once legal regulation is established, it's very hard to undo how it is done. So we need to make sure that when the countries that it's happening right from the start correctly. And as we will now see, different countries are at different points on the pathway to reform. So positive noises are being heard around the world. However, in the UK, we're having a very different conversation. So this is the situation in the UK, and we are at record drug-related deaths. We've just hit another high this year of 4,300 drug-related deaths. Scotland is by rate, the drug death capital of the world, which is an absolutely terrible tragedy. And it has really sprung upon Scotland that this is an issue of highest importance. And we can only hope that they can come down, but nothing so far with cutting of drug services. It has been really, really hard on the issue, and it's only been spiraling. As well as that, as I previously mentioned, the drug market is ever expanding, and it's extremely powerful. And we've also seen the rapidly increasing county lines phenomenon, which has, though taken the media's attention recently, has kind of been setting itself up for the last 10 years. And in all of this, we have a very hardline law enforcement approach coming from the government, very unwilling to take this away from the criminal justice and the Home Office Department and put it as a public health issue. And I think it's really remarkable, since we have had several reports. We've had 2 committee reports in the last year and a half recommending at least decriminalisation for personal possession and the opening up of overdose prevention centres. However, on both occasions, these committee reports, one from the Health and Social Care Select Committee and the other from the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, were roundly rejected by government in favour of this law enforcement approach. However, the good news, as I said, the heroin-assisted treatment rollout is an extremely positive step, and we really hope that this pilot that's being run in Middlesbrough, it will serve as precedent to reach out to create more around the country. We also, despite the government being hard set against decriminalisation, have things called diversion schemes being set up by police forces across the country. And these are essentially decriminalisation, but de facto decriminalisation, where people an individual will not be arrested for their personal possession of a drug, but rather get a community warning. And this is a really interesting way that we are seeing local reform happen and drug policy reform happening at local level, because though we have from the top down from Westminster a total decline not wanting to do decriminalisation, we are seeing that police forces are taking this into their own hands and recognising that actually there is value to a diversion scheme and to not be criminalising users on interaction by the police. It is not worth their time or money to be doing this and doesn't actually help the situation. So there are very interesting ways of the mechanisms of drug policy reform in the UK, and they're really coming from local level work. Similarly to that is the momentum gaining to set up drug consumption rooms. We also call them overdose prevention centres, which has been especially spurred on by an individual called Peter Cricant in Scotland, who last year decided to take matters into his own hands after last year's record drug-related deaths in Scotland, and set up a drug consumption van in Glasgow, which provides a safe space for people to consume, specifically, I mean, in most part heroin, but also cocaine. And it has had no deaths in that time. So it has really been welcomed by the community, and he's had great support. And it's captured, fortunately, the view of Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland, and we hope that this will be a good example of why we should be setting them up in the UK, though there is amounts of evidence from around the world that these are extremely successful ways of harm reduction and stopping people from dying, as there have been no recorded deaths in any of the drug consumption rooms across the world. And the first one was set up in the 90s. We still have quite a resistance to it in the UK from government, particularly as it's argued that they will encourage drug use, which there is no evidence of. They only act as a harm reducer. Then we also have a continued rollout of overdose prevention drug naloxone, which most recently Police Scotland has taken on and have had some really positive reports of immediate use. This overdose prevention drug is used on opioid overdoses, and it immediately reverses an overdose. So it is an instant lifesaver. And though it sounds like a very small thing, it's actually very significant, because for a very long time, these were also quite opposed as a thing to carry around. And now drug services hand them out across the country. You can get trained to administer naloxone and carry it yourself as well, and if you have a drug service near you that offers that. And this leads me on to our campaign, which is the 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, because what I've just shown you is very, very different from our legally regulated market vision that we want to have both in the UK and internationally. And we're not talking about cannabis legalization in the UK. That is not on the agenda at the moment. We're not even able, currently there seem to be obstacles to establishing decriminalisation of personal possession of use, where you can't be criminalised for that, or even drug consumption rooms to prevent overdoses. So we're having we're on a very different playing field down at the UK level. So the 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act campaign is timely because it's the 50th anniversary. So the same year that the war on drugs was declared, we established what has essentially remained relatively unchanged, our drug laws in the UK. If anything, penalties have just become harsher over time. And I thought I'd give you a little window into how we are trying to capture people's ideas of the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's, I think, and we think, an abomination that we have a law that is 50 years old and has not been reviewed, and there's not even political appetite to review it. and we are continuing to use it. And so here we have both slightly whimsical, as on your right, your phone in 1971, because we really want to impress on the public that are not engaged in drug policy reform how outdated our drug laws are and how not fit for purpose they are. But also that we want to say they were never fit for purpose. This isn't just an age thing. This isn't they were acceptable in 1971. It was wrong from the start, and we need a totally different approach to our Misuse of Drugs Act. To that purpose, we have also created a timeline, which I just managed to do a little snapshot of on the right, which has 50 years of drug policy reform, drug reports, data and statistics on use and deaths that have happened in the UK since 1971. And it paints a neat picture, but also quite a sad picture of how we have been progressing, or rather regressing, in our drug policy in the UK over the last 50 years. I will post a link to all of these things that I have shared so that you can take a look at them in your own time. But what we're really trying to establish is that then the time is now, because the time is always now. We cannot wait another year. We cannot have another 50 years of this prohibition. We actually have colleagues in Belgium who are campaigning for their 100-year anniversary of their drug laws. We cannot reach that. We need to have reform and new legislation now. To that end, we are trying to encourage parliamentarians to support this movement for change. And I think it's really, really important when I talk about this, that we must acknowledge that actually in the UK, it's actually just very difficult for politicians to just come out and talk about drug policy reform. It's still a treacherous subject that people don't want to touch. And what we are trying to do with this campaign is establish a safe space where politicians feel emboldened to come out and speak out against our current drug laws, but also call for significant change. These are our initial 50 parliamentarians that have supported our statement, which we are really, really pleased to have. And we hope that this will encourage more to come out and speak, because we are starting it from a very low bar in the UK. We are just trying to get people to say things need to change. That's all we want for our 27th of May launch, is an acknowledgement from a significant set of the parliamentarians to say that we must review the Misuse of Drugs Act. Now, from that, we would then offer alternative legislation, but currently we just need to be having the conversation where individuals are shying away from it. We want to show that this is not a dangerous space politically, and it's actually timely to be discussing it now. Actually, I will just, and in light of that, we are also encouraging people to write to their MPs if they want to encourage them to sign up to our statement. We have a template letter that we've been using, and this is a key part of our campaign, because MPs listen to they should listen to their constituents, and that's the key bit. So we encourage anyone, if you would like to support this campaign, to write to your MP. I can provide you with a template letter. We also provide support on approaching your MP or talking to them, and are comfortable to have a conversation with anyone who would like that. And this is ultimately where the change lies. We can have public support. We've seen recently that there is great support for cannabis legal regulation in the UK. However, there needs to be impetus at the top as well. We may have the local reforms bubbling away underneath, but we do need wholesale change at the top too. And for that reason, we are running this campaign for a full year, right through to next year, hoping that we can say, let's not let it turn 51, because we cannot afford another year of drug-related deaths hitting record highs. and we can't afford the criminal market to increase in size and strength. It's just not a viable thing for society. It doesn't make a healthy and safe society. So those are my, that's our website. But yes, like I said, I will add anything that I've just talked about, which is, I realize, quite a lot, into the chat for you to link through if you're interested in looking at all the other information. And I look forward to any questions you have. So thank you very much.
Okay, Esther, thank you very much. That was really, really good. Round of applause, please, for Esther.
Jamie, would you mind if I shared the screen? I just wanted to show the cocaine packaging we've mocked up.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Tim's in charge of the screen. I don't get trusted with that.
Sorry, thank you, Tim. I just thought I'd get this up whilst we're waiting for anyone who's interested.
It's pretty unglamorous packaging, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It was really interesting, the process of creating it, because we were working with a design agency who really wanted to make it look beautiful and kept sending us iterations, and we would send it back saying, no, that's too nice, that looks too cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was surprising how many times we had to come back to it, because we kept finding things that were actually still too appealing.
It's a bit more in line with cigarette packaging now, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And actually the UK guidelines for tobacco packaging are very good and have been really effective in reducing smoking. And we actually use that, as you can see, the vial for this cocaine would be in that horrible brown, green color, the same color as tobacco packaging.
Yeah, the color scheme on the cigarette packaging is not appealing, all the pictures.
No, exactly. You don't want it to be boxes you want to present on your shelf.
No.
But similarly, we then didn't want to go too pharmaceutical with the colors, because they also have a history of quite neglectful approaches to drug supply, especially as we've seen in the US with opiates. So it was a really hard balance line to tread. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's
sharing, shall I?
It's 8:40, so I think we'll get going. We've got lots and lots of really good questions, which is really good. So I'll kind of go through them in a sort of time order. So rather than subject order, because that's far too complicated for me to collate that. So from top to bottom, we'll go with Kevin as messaged. Says, hi Esther, he chairs a large health charity with statutory powers in Torbay. He says, are we already seeing a gradual unofficial decriminalisation? Gives the example, for example, the police now ignore certain Class B usage and even a certain level of tolerance in regards to Class A's.
Are we seeing that? Yes.
Yeah.
So off the top of my head, I don't have all the police forces that are doing this. I know Avon and Somerset Police are. Durham, I think, were the ones who first started this diversion scheme, and then it has spread. And Thames Valley Police, which has had an excellent person leading on it, who's really advocated for diversion, have also established this idea, and this is my legal knowledge of prosecution and arrest isn't very good, so I'm really sorry if anyone is about to question me on this, but it's totally depending on police force. So in Avon and Somerset, first time you are caught with a amount considered for personal possession, you will not get anything. You will not get a warning. You will not get charged. So it doesn't show up on your criminal record at all. And then you are encouraged to go to a drug education program. So that's specifically in Avon and Somerset. However, I do know that for theirs, it only counts up to the first 3 strikes. So there is a logging of it that doesn't come up on records, but then what happens after that? The criminalization continues. However, the drug education program is very much in line with what we've seen in Portugal, where that is how they set up their decriminalization, which is full decriminalization of all drugs and encouraged to do. I think you actually have to do a drug education program. It's kind of like a speeding ticket idea where you then need to go on an awareness course. And it is totally dependent on police force, whether it is just Class Bs, so cannabis, or whether it is all drugs for personal use.
Do you think that's a slightly undesirable position where it's sort of police force dependent, where perhaps it should be a more consistent approach nationally?
Yeah, I think that is unfortunate. So it's interesting though, because it's very dual-sided in that way, because you want it to be a national thing. However, because the government isn't keen on implementing nationalised decriminalisation, the police forces have actually played an incredibly important role in pushing the agenda and pushing forward this reform, which we probably wouldn't have been getting otherwise. So though it is dependent on police force by police force, since there is such a stalemate at the top, I think this is really, really positive step. And I think we are probably, off the top of my head, I think it's 9 or 10 police forces now that have implemented diversion. And more recently, we've had colleagues in Australia talking to us on how to implement diversion there based on our models. So there is a really great positive learning cycle. And just to add to that, very strangely, I think there might be a semantic issue around decriminalisation and diversion, because Kit Malthouse, who has drugs under his remit in the Home Office, has positively acknowledged diversion schemes in the past, but outright said no to decriminalisation when they are very effectively the same thing. So yeah. It's a strange thing.
Is there any word on policies from? I know, for example, the Devon and Cornwall Police and Crime Commissioner position is up for election in week after next. Are there any other police and crime commissioners nationwide who are involved in promoting or detracting?
So current one, we've had Arvon from North Wales. Gosh, I can't remember his full name, so sorry, Arvon, who has been a great advocate of diversion as a police and crime commissioner, but is stepping down in this election round. I would honestly love to speak to more of it, but I think one of my colleagues will probably be better to talk about that. But it will be interesting, because there is likely to be a bit of a change in the police and crime commissioners in some areas, and actually in others it's kind of our best guess of who's going to win. So it's kind of a weird time to talk about local reform and where people stand, because we're in a state of flux.
Okay, all right. Moving away from the police, then. John Dowdy asks, believes that drugs such as heroin were prescribed freely on the NHS to addicts in the 1950s as a means of getting addicts to reduce and eliminate their drug dependency. Is that a policy that your organisation would support now?
Yes, definitely. And that is the heroin assisted treatment program that I mentioned that's happening in Middlesbrough is exactly that, but a modern iteration of it, because though it has been sort of existing over time, by the end of the 90s, I think the number of people who are on this program had dwindled to about 100. So this is trying to revitalize this approach of harm reduction and encourage. This pilot is playing a really important role in encouraging funding for it, because in some ways the upfront costs are quite high compared to using methadone treatment, but the results of that and how much they save in general public and social expenditure is really huge. So yes, definitely it is part of our policy. We really support that. Oh, I think we've lost Jamie. Shall I don't know, what shall I do? I've got some things in this chat, so I can read those off if that's, or do you have other questions?
There are some questions in the general chat from Ushi. If you've got any ones that have come to you, then you can certainly answer those. But perhaps if we start with those 4 questions from Ushi.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So the first one is, have we considered nationalisation? And yes, we have. We have outlined our idea of nationalisation, especially in our guide on how to regulate stimulants, because we think that what should, specifically for cocaine, MDMA and amphetamines, be is a production created by license from government. However, government is then the only purchaser of the product, and then also the only supplier of the product. So that is a kind of nationalisation program, and that is would mean that taxes would be taken from there and revenue increased to the government. But it is very varying depending on the drug, because cannabis, for example, we do not advocate nationalisation necessarily, as we think that there is opportunity for communities that have been negatively impacted by particularly over-policing of cannabis, but drugs in general, to have a space in the new market. And we have seen this. There have been programs in the US where they've been trying to incorporate negatively affected communities, especially the Black community, and trying to then participate in what is the future of the new legally regulated market and having their own cannabis shops. But yeah, that for some things such as stimulants, we would advocate for a nationalist system. Hi, Jamie. I've just been answering some questions.
Yeah, sorry, I do apologise. Some loss of power, which appears to have had the unfortunate effect of clearing the chat that I had on the screen. I'm just trying to see if there's any way of getting it back. I don't know if that happens when you leave a Zoom meeting, it just clears the chat.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I am the host of the meeting now, but I can't see the messages that went to you. So apologies to people, but
no,
it hasn't been asked so far. Perhaps you could send it to Jamie again. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go through the questions provided by Ushi in the meantime.
Yeah, if you could, Esther. Apologies. Yeah, it looks like it's completely cleared the questions. So apologies if you've asked one to me on a direct message. If you can pop it over again. I'm plugged into the wall now.
Cool. Okay. Well, I'll continue running through the chat. And yeah, if anyone remembers their questions, do just put them through again. So can I say something about the experience of other European countries? Well, I guess that really, so I'm not very good on the European countries, partly because there's not been so much drastic change in the way that we've been seeing the legalization or regulation of cannabis in North America and also Central America. Luxembourg did commit to legally regulating cannabis as part of their agenda. However, they've been quite slow on that. And I'm not sure if it's been slightly put on the back burner. Malta is a unusual small space that will be legally regulating cannabis and have put forward quite a positive looking bill. In other terms, so Switzerland has been really at the forefront of harm reduction, and they have really pushed forward overdose prevention centres, and they have many, and they've been really successful, and they work as an extremely great example of how overdose prevention centres work in our community. And we really, we've in the past taken over police and crime commissioners and others to show them exactly how successful they are and on implementation. And actually off the back of that, Switzerland is just setting up a pilot for legal regulation of cannabis starting on the 15th of May. So they're doing a pilot legally regulated market. The Netherlands has just legalized. I'm really sorry if I get this slightly wrong. There's always so much cannabis stuff. Production in the Netherlands of cannabis is also in the space currently this year. So yeah, it's a bit bitty. It's very different to the kind of sweeping changes we're seeing in other places. But cannabis, I think, is the top one, and I think that is kind of in the eye line of all drug policy reformers as the most attainable reform that we will see. So yeah, it's slow, and COVID hasn't helped for that. It's really slowed things. Why is Scotland suffering so much? Yes, that is really hard. I saw that question and I was trying to think how I could answer that adequately. I think it's very difficult to say exactly because there are a multitude of reasons why issues become such a large problem, and it can't just be associated with prohibition. So I think social deprivation is probably playing quite a large part, but I think it would be probably wrong of me to speak to that too strongly, as I only really work in the realms of the drug policy element of it. But yeah, I think we are hopeful Nicola Sturgeon has taken this on as a key issue and has appointed a new drugs advisor, and hopefully they'll be re-establishing vigor into properly solving this problem. And then finally, in the US, drugs preferred, sorry, I'm just reading out the question for everyone, by Black people carry harsh sentences. Is this true in the UK? And if so, is this just a consequence of racism? I think that's a really interesting question. And there's an excellent book by an author I can't remember called Drug Laws, The New Jim Crow, which really outlines how drug laws have been used as a tool to racially racially attack communities of color. And in the UK, so as a person who's asked the question, in the US, it's that cocaine powder versus crack cocaine have significantly different criminal charges. I think it's something like 10 times the amount of years you can get for crack cocaine for the same amount of possession as cocaine powder. And since they have been historically linked to Black communities of use, by that end, that would suggest that there's a huge amount of racial undertone in drug laws. In the UK, there isn't necessarily a drug distinction difference. However, there is over-policing of Black communities in stop and search. I think Black communities on the most recent data, 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs than a white person. And it is so disproportionate and done on such very simple things. And we have got a story on Anyone's Child from Dwayne, which I recommend you go and see in relation to this, where he was stopped and searched because police thought they'd seen granules of cannabis in the footwell of his car. So it's really punitive and quite blatantly discriminatory. There's a problem here, definitely, but for a very different reason to the US. I hope that answers it okay. And then Do we take a different stance on native plants? Sorry, I'm just reading it as I go. Yes, seems crazy. Mushrooms are fine whilst they are mold, but a drug as soon as they are picked. But they might also present different risks if decriminalizing possession. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, we are coming out with a psychedelics guide this year on how to regulate them specifically, because that is the other thing is they've all been put under the umbrella of drugs, but all the drugs are very, very different in the way they act on people and their harms and risks as well. I think the first thing that we say is that we don't want to ever create a dichotomy where there are safer or less safe drugs, which would mean some should be legalized before others. We actually think that actually the more dangerous a drug is, the more urgent it is to legally regulate, because it needs to be safely provided. But actually with something like mushrooms is in a very similar way with cannabis or cocaine or actually even opium. It is a plant. What we would say is that we need decriminalization of everything. Certainly, if you have got psychedelics and you've got a legally regulated market, it would look very different to something such as cocaine. We probably wouldn't be advocating for strict pharmaceutical retail of psychedelics when, as you say, mushrooms can just grow, and we would be far more looking towards a market which is more based on social clubs, such as cannabis clubs that we've seen crop up in Spain, where you can have a collective where you grow together and use together. And I think that's probably far more realistic for something like that.
Okay, good, thank you. I've got a couple of questions sort of trickling back in. Simon, it's a bit of a two-part question from Simon, who says that damage from tobacco, I guess the medical issues surrounded with smoking, is more expensive than the actual revenue gained from it. Do you have a revenue prediction of costs and education in terms of drug reform and what that's going to do to in revenue terms?
Yeah, so I don't have any numbers to hand. We had a cost benefit analysis report done for cannabis specifically in the UK 10 years ago, and actually very, very recently have identified that it's kind of time to do a new one. I think it's difficult. In some ways you can make parallels with the tobacco industry, but in others is that the tobacco industry had decades of totally unregulated access to the market, where not only did it begin with a social idea that they were even possibly good for you, but just encouraged and marketed and advertised for an extremely long time. So I think the after effects of a completely off the wall market that can do whatever it likes have had, that is what was extremely damaging about it and has cost so much to the public purse in terms of health. It's a bit of a loose answer. I can't give any numbers, but I will link to our previous cost benefit analysis. And I think our idea is that with a proper legal regulation, we want to avoid the health harms. That is actually one of our core visions, is ensuring public health is at the top of everything. So yeah.
Okay. Simon also asks, he refers back to his former GP who queried prescription only, in inverted commas, for regular medications as problematic. Would legal regulation prevent people acquiring currently illegal drugs for medical use? Goes on to say that the NHS is restricting a drug that he may benefit from, as the NHS provider is is priced out of the market, but can be bought overseas for a fraction of the cost. So I guess the question is it going to prevent some sort of legitimate but non-prescription uses of certain drugs that people find useful?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because we've seen that with medical cannabis in the UK. Medical cannabis was legalized in 2018, and there continue to be significant obstacles to access for patients because it lies in prescription through the NHS, and the rollout isn't fast enough or effective enough or large enough, and actually the costs are too great for most. I think it's certainly something we have to be mindful of, is that in any kind of proposals that we make, there is the reality of who will be implementing it, and all we can do is best educate policymakers to ensure that that doesn't happen, and that access is not restrictive and isn't just a kind of like media headline of legal regulation, which doesn't actually lead to helping the people who want to be prescribed. Yeah, that is definitely in our sight, because we're already seeing it happen. So yeah, it's a really important thing to consider.
Okay, all right. Changing tack completely then. Our chair, Jessica. Yes, that's Jessica. So there seem to be parallels here with reform within the sex work industry, as it were. Can you see those parallels and in that sort of reformation?
Yeah, so I mean, only in like the very shallowest understanding of sex work reform, obviously from me, because I follow it just in my as a personal interest. It is an interesting parallel, because what you're essentially trying to, it's got such a heavy moral weight behind it in society, both sex work and drug use, and what you're trying to do in reform is push through the kind of moral condemnation that has been built up in society over time, and trying to humanize, so in our case, drug users, and in sex work reform is sex workers, and realize that they deserve policy that protects them. That's the ultimate thing, and why they're not getting it is hugely down to the idea of what we think is right and wrong as a society, and how that's been ingrained in our laws. So yeah, sorry, that's a very loose way of saying it, because very, very, very interesting thing, and we have seen it. We have put out a paper in collaboration on sex work, so I can send that over, which you may find interesting.
Okay.
But yeah.
Cool. Thank you. There were in the dim and distant past, pre-plugging in the charger, I did see a question from somebody about what support there was amongst MPs, and you alluded to earlier, or put the pictures up, and there were 50 MPs, I think it was, that had come out in support. Is there any indication that number will grow, do you think? And how many of them were Labour and how many of them were Tory?
Yeah, no, that is, I think, a really important question. So they're parliamentarians, the initial 50, so that's both MPs and peers. So 43 of those are MPs. We have Scottish National Party is taken drug law reform in the UK as a huge push, and it's very closely linked with independence as well. So we have quite broad support from the Scottish National Party. The Lib Dems have it in their manifesto, so they are also a very positive law reform. In Labour, it's interesting because there are some really, really strong advocates for drug policy reform and have been for a very long time. And however, it's quite split and can also sort of lie on factional lines. And it's very different from the great MPs who've really come out and are absolutely clear on how we need to see drug policy reform in the UK and Labour, versus something like Keir Starmer a couple of weeks ago being interviewed about our drug laws and saying that just about right, which for us was a real knockback, because he doesn't want to, clearly doesn't want to speak out about drug policy reform. We haven't had much from him, haven't heard much. And so when that was the first time we heard it, and to hear that he thought they were just about right, was a kind of reality check of actually where we are sat here.
I was going to ask, do you think it would be easier with a different administration, a Labour administration, and easier to push reform through compared to where we are now, but perhaps not from what you've just said?
Yeah, I mean, or possibly but that's posturing. So I mean, like, you can't guess how it could be. So in the current situation, it seems that whether it's lack of knowledge of drug policy, which we find is actually very frequent, is just, it's such a scary thing to talk out about publicly. I mean, partly of what I just said previously in relation to the sex work parallel is because it's got such a moral weight behind it. And people already have very strong ideas about what drug policy means. So we find politicians don't feel like they know enough to talk about it. And then I think on the Conservative side, we have a couple of MPs who are really, really pro-reform, who are on our list, and they see the public health harms and are behind it. However, it's far harder, definitely. I think we are hoping to sort of get possibly some, just to see that there is growing challenge to the status quo, and that might empower some to speak out. Actually, very interestingly, though not necessarily full outright coming out for support of the statement, just pushing that we just showing that people are talking about this and that MPs are willing to put their name to reform. We've had behind the scenes conversations with politicians that have never been willing to have a conversation with us before. So it can be overt. Great, yes, I will tweet about this. But actually, there's also been some chipping away, which, though it seems like a very small win, it's still a win. Yeah.
Paul alludes to that actually in his point. In these cases, ideology appears to override well-being, which is always a bad thing. He says he's known several people who've died from drug misuse. None of them would have died if the drugs they were taking had been regulated. So yes, this sort of overarching ideology versus the sort of the well-being and the best for the person.
I completely agree, and I think the ideology is allowed to run away from why the UK even signed up to the UN Convention in 1961. It wasn't about criminalization, and it was about protection and public health. It came from fear, but it was well intended, and actually it has turned into this, I think, a very popular saying, I think, has come from the current government, is cutting the head off the snake, which our favorite retort is to say, yeah, but it's a hydra, because it's just, you cannot do it through law enforcement at all. But it's just the reality of what we currently have, is law enforcement seems to be winning. And then we see it in what Labour seems to have identified as a winning tactic for them as well, is actually focusing on law enforcement, which is a really hard thing to come up against, because I think logically people, they kind of, I think, maybe emotionally react to that idea as the right solution. yeah, no, I'm really sorry to hear that about, yeah.
Presumably, overall crime reduction is a big strand of this as well, because I mean we know that the drug market sort of influences crime on lots and lots of different levels. I'm just talking specifically sort of domestically in the UK. I presume there's sort of work, or it's been looked into as to how that might affect statistics going forward if there was reform.
Yeah, so I mean, something like that heroin assisted treatment pilot was really interesting and revealing exactly how much just supplying your own personal drug use, problematic drug use, has a huge amount of acquisitive crime linked to it to fund it. So even just on this very, very low level, the idea that you, weirdly, once you have access to drugs prescribed, if you need them, you're not going to steal to fund that, is a huge change, because it makes up a huge amount of petty crime that you see around the country. And then far bigger things, something like county lines, is a demonstration of what law enforcement has itself created, because it has allowed this sort of kind of hidden drug market to exist, but also react to law enforcement. So when law enforcement pushes, the market reacts and adjusts and is flexible. And county lines was one of those very flexible things. It identifies, it is its own, it should be understood as its own business. It has its own model, and it knows what it's doing and how to continue making money. And something like county lines is a perfect example of where criminalization has pushed vulnerable people into the hands of criminal organizations, and then made them, I mean, it's essentially modern slavery, participating involuntarily in the market.
You'd think that would be at the forefront of sort of policy making minds, wouldn't you, in terms of, crime reduction is a good thing, to put it very, very simply.
Yeah.
You think that would be a key bit of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do try and present that. I think that's really key in some of our messaging that we do. It's also very tempting to show the financial benefits, but obviously once you go down that route, then you kind of tempt the kind of corporate takeover of markets. But that, for our current government, yeah, those two things are very, very alluring. However, seemingly not quite enough yet.
Yeah. I've been sitting here having weird thoughts about being able to go and, not personally, being able to go and visit a cocaineist shop as opposed to a tobacconist, which is putting it in a sort of almost humorous way. I don't know, but I know you've sort of touched on this. Who would actually supply? You mentioned pharmacies, and I know you mentioned, it's not sort of thing you're going to find in the next supermarket aisle. How do you envisage that rolling out in terms of how it's supplied to the public and shop fronts and actual outlets?
Yeah. So I think starting right from production, there would be licenses granted by government to produce, with then production, those producers selling only to the government, which would then mean that the outlets are government-run outlets only. So, and then this is specifically for something like cocaine or MDMA, and they would then have licensed outlets with people who are trained to supply. However, though we have called them pharmacy-style outlets, we have not suggested that they would be the current pharmacies we know, there are a couple of articles we have done in the Pharmacist Journal, which I can also, if you do any follow-up emails, I can link all of these things because I cannot think where that would be right now.
Yeah,
but it's an interesting conversation because we have decided to call it pharmacy style outlets because it's what we know, and so I think it's the closest example to what we think this would look like. But actually, would it be incorporated into a pharmacy degree, or would there be their own pharmacist training that would specialize specifically in this? And I think that's quite a interesting idea. In terms of how shops would look, it would be very much like that cocaine packaging I shared. We don't want it to look exciting. There would be no external advertising. There would be very limited identifiable imagery from the outside that could suggest this is a cocaine shop. And it would be strictly 18s and over in the UK, or obviously other countries have 21 limits, so I mean varied depending on state, and the packaging would not be appealing either, and everything would come with a conversation with whoever is working, the vendor, and there would be a harm reduction message, how to use, and specifically the packaging itself would have a regulated dosage, so you wouldn't just get a random amount like you can now get on the street.
Okay. Okay, so we're quite a way off from sort of seeing a government sort of run cocaine shop like next to Timpson's and the cafe behind the tills in the supermarket kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think currently we'll be glad if we can just get the Misuse of Drugs Act reviewed and establish wholesale decriminalisation as a starting point. I think we're in a very different ballpark. But that is to say, I mean, we sit in the office and say, when do you think cannabis legalization will happen? And it's really anyone's guess, because it's a bit like medical cannabis, and it's actually like any reform in any sector. It's a window of opportunity and a problem, and it all comes together, and that can sometimes be very unpredictable. So something like the drug consumption rooms is there, or overdose prevention centers. Sorry, I keep using two different terms. They are a possibility in Scotland way more than they were a year ago because of the high drug-related deaths, and then this guerrilla illegal site that's operating, and it's suddenly created a moment where it kind of may facilitate change. So
okay,
yeah.
Okay, all right, great stuff. Roger says he sent you a question. I'm not sure whether you've got that.
Oh, is this the UN treaties? I've got, yes. In view of UN treaties, how free is the government to change UK legislation? I'm not very, very good on UN law, but Canada has, and so has Uruguay, and so has Bolivia. Bolivia did it slightly differently as they stepped out the treaty and came back into it with a amendment. Though the UN says that Canada is now in breach of its treaty, and similarly Uruguay, they have been operating legally regulated cannabis markets for, I mean, now 8 years in Uruguay, 4 in Canada. So, 2 in Canada. So it's it is a breach of treaty, but it isn't impossible. My colleague would hate my explanation of the UN rules there.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, well, unless anybody else has any final questions, Roger says thank you, by the way. It's come through to me. I think probably best to say thank you, Esther, and I think we'd probably all like to show our appreciation for what I think has been a really, really interesting talk and really, really interesting questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's always great to talk about it. So
no
great
problem.
questions.